The sun had set, casting a deep orange glow across the ranch. The peaceful quiet of the evening was interrupted only by the soft chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind through the tall grasses. Eliza stood on the porch, her arms crossed loosely over her chest as she gazed at the horizon. It had been months since she had arrived in the West, and the changes in herself were as vast as the landscape that stretched out before her. She had grown stronger, both physically and emotionally. The days were still long and tiring, but the work had become easier, almost second nature. She no longer felt like an outsider. She was a part of this place now, a part of Daniel's life, and though they still had their differences, something had shifted between them in a way neither of them had expected. It had started small, with the subtle changes in their interactions, the brief smiles exchanged when they passed each other, the occasional, almost hesitant conversation after a long day's work. But now, as Eliza stood there, she couldn't ignore the deeper connection that had begun to form. She could feel it in the way they worked together, the way their glances lingered longer than they had before, the unspoken understanding that passed between them when words weren't enough. As if on cue, Daniel appeared from the side of the house, walking toward her with his usual steady stride. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his face weathered and tired from a day spent working under the hot sun. But tonight, for some reason, he seemed different. His usual quiet reserve had softened, and there was a subtle change in his posture as he approached her. "Long day," he said. His voice still rough, but with a hint of something more, something warmer. Eliza smiled and nodded. "It's always a long day here." Daniel glanced at her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he looked away. "Yeah," he agreed, his lips tugging into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "But it's the kind of work that feels like it's worth something." Eliza's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had heard him speak like this before, when he wasn't speaking about the land or the tasks at hand, but this time it felt different. This time there was a sense of shared understanding. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. "I think I'm starting to understand that," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the months she had spent here. "When I first got here, I didn't know if I'd make it. Everything was so different, so hard, but now I see it. I see the purpose in all of it." Daniel turned his head to look at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a softness in his gaze that Eliza hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability that spoke of things he had kept hidden for so long. "I know what you mean," Daniel said quietly. "This place, this life, it's not easy, but it's real. It's honest. There's no pretending here. If you can't handle it, it breaks you. But if you stick with it, it gives you something. It gives you purpose." Eliza took a deep breath, her chest tightening with emotion. She had come to the West seeking a new beginning. But what she had found was something she hadn't expected, something far more complicated and yet more rewarding than she had ever imagined. Daniel, too, seemed to be changing. The man who had been so distant and cold when she first arrived was now a little more open, a little more willing to share himself. She could see the cracks in his tough exterior, the pain he carried with him from his past. It wasn't that he had healed, but that he had begun to trust her enough to show her the parts of himself that had been buried for so long. Eliza stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "I'm glad I came here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never imagined it would be this hard, but I'm glad I stayed." Daniel's expression softened, and for a moment Eliza thought he might say something more than the simple words they had exchanged in the past, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that said everything. "I'm glad you stayed, too," he murmured almost to himself. Before turning away and walking toward the barn, Eliza watched him go, her thoughts swirling in her mind. She had always known there was something more to Daniel than the cold, hardened man he presented to the world. But now, as she stood on the porch watching him disappear into the evening shadows, she realized that there was still so much she didn't understand about him, so much she wanted to know. The next few days were a blur of hard work, the kind of work that could wear a person down to their bones. But it was different now. Eliza wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She was learning new things every day, becoming more skilled at the tasks Daniel had taught her. And with each passing day, she felt a growing connection to him, one that was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as they were working together in the barn, Eliza found herself stealing glances at Daniel more often than usual. He was focused on fixing one of the fences, his brow furrowed in concentration. But as she watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more between them than just shared tasks and mutual respect. Finally, she couldn't keep it inside anymore. She set down the tools she had been working with and walked over to where Daniel was working. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I've been thinking." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "About us," she said quietly. "I know we haven't talked much about anything personal. But I just wanted you to know that I appreciate everything. The work, the quiet moments we've shared. I think maybe we could be more than just two people who happen to be working together." Daniel set down the tool he had been holding and took a step toward her. For a moment there was a long silence, filled only by the sound of the wind outside. Then slowly, he nodded. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, his voice more open than it had ever been. "But I do know this. I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad we're here." Eliza smiled, her heart lifting. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was a beginning. A beginning that neither of them had expected, but one that felt right. The days that followed were filled with more work, yes, but also with more moments shared between them. Quiet conversations after the sunset, small gestures of kindness that spoke volumes more than words ever could. They still didn't know what would come of their connection, but it didn't matter. For the first time since she arrived, Eliza felt like she had truly found a place for herself. And in the end, that was all she had ever wanted, a place where she could be herself. A place where she could find belonging, not just in the land, but in the people around her. As the seasons slowly changed, so did their relationship. The bond between them grew stronger, built on trust, shared experiences, and the understanding that they had both found something in each other that they had been missing for so long. Eliza had come to the West, looking for a new beginning. What she had found was a love that neither of them had anticipated, but one that would change their lives forever. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had finally found where she truly belonged. As the days turned into weeks, Eliza began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life. It was hard work, no doubt, but there was a sense of purpose in every task she undertook. She became more familiar with the animals, the land, and the way things worked around the ranch. At first, everything had seemed so foreign, so overwhelming, but now it was starting to feel like a routine. She had learned to feed the horses, milk the cows, and gather eggs from the chickens. The days passed in a blur of sun and dust, sweat and dirt, but there was something satisfying about the simplicity of it all. Daniel, however, remained as distant as ever. He rarely spoke to her beyond the basics, telling her what needed to be done and when to do it. When he did talk, his voice was often short, almost as if he was too tired to waste words. Eliza couldn't help but wonder if he even noticed the effort she was putting in. She wanted to prove herself, wanted him to see that she was capable of more than just the chores he assigned her. But every time she tried to offer an idea or speak her mind, he would either ignore her or give her a look that made her feel foolish for even speaking. It wasn't that Daniel was mean, he just seemed detached, cold almost. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of a past filled with hardship and loss. Eliza could see it in the way he worked tirelessly, never once slowing down or taking a break. She had heard bits and pieces of his story over the past few weeks, usually through the townspeople, but it was never enough to fully understand who he was or what had made him this way. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Eliza found herself sitting on the porch of the small cabin, trying to cool off after a long day. The air was still warm, but there was a cool breeze that made the heat bearable. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the land, the rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant sound of horses grazing, the faint hum of insects in the air. It was peaceful in a way, even though the work was constant. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Daniel walking toward her, his boots crunching against the gravel path. He looked tired, his face shadowed by a long day's work, but there was something different in his stride today. There was a kind of hesitation, a pause in his usual steady pace, as if he was unsure of what to say or do. "Eliza," he said quietly, his voice sounding almost reluctant. I wanted to talk to you." Eliza blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. He had never seemed interested in talking to her before, so this unexpected invitation left her unsure of how to respond. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on the front of her dress. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel looked at her, his eyes slightly narrowing as if searching for the right words. "I know I haven't been the easiest to get along with," he began, the words coming out slowly, almost as if they didn't come naturally to him. "I haven't exactly made you feel welcome here, and for that I'm sorry." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not from someone as hard-edged as Daniel. She had always thought of him as someone who didn't care much about anyone's feelings. The fact that he was speaking to her like this caught her off guard. I appreciate that," Eliza said softly, unsure of what to say next. "I've just been trying to do my best here. I didn't know what to expect, but I've been learning." Daniel nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the sun was setting in a brilliant wash of orange and pink. "This place, it's not easy. Life here never is. I've been doing this alone for a long time. It's not that I don't appreciate your help, I do, but I've gotten used to working on my own. I didn't want to burden you with everything." Eliza stood in silence for a moment, taking in his words. She had always seen him as a man who was distant and perhaps even a bit resentful of her presence, but now she understood a little more. He wasn't cold because he didn't care. He was cold because he had been hurt, and the pain of his past had built a wall around him, one that kept others from getting too close. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Cross," Eliza said quietly. "I've been doing my best. I don't mind working with you." Daniel turned to face her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "I know you're not afraid of work," he replied, his voice quieter now. "But sometimes the hardest part is letting someone else in. I'm not good at that. I never have been." Eliza nodded, her heart swelling with understanding. She had always been someone who believed that people could change, that with time and effort even the most stubborn hearts could soften. Maybe Daniel wasn't as unreachable as she had thought. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to let someone else in, someone who cared. As the evening wore on, the two of them sat on the porch in silence, watching the last light of the day fade away. The air was cooler now, and the crickets began their nightly chorus. For the first time since arriving, Eliza felt a sense of calm settle over her. This place, this life, it was hard, no doubt, but it was also starting to feel like home. Over the next few days, Eliza noticed small changes in Daniel. He was still quiet, still distant in many ways, but he began to trust her with more tasks around the ranch. He would show her how to fix the fences, how to care for the horses, and sometimes when the work was done, they would sit together for a meal in silence, something they had never done before. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Slowly, she began to feel like she wasn't just a stranger in this place anymore. She was becoming part of it, part of his life. And as she worked alongside him, something else began to change. There was a spark between them, something neither of them had planned for. But in the quiet moments when their eyes met across the dinner table or when they exchanged brief words, there was an undeniable connection, one that neither of them could ignore. Eliza didn't know where this would lead, or if it would lead anywhere at all, but she knew that something had shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this ranch, this tough life in the West wasn't going to be as lonely as she had thought. Maybe there was more to this man, this life, than she had first realized. And for the first time, Eliza allowed herself to believe that this new beginning, the one she had set out to find, was finally within reach. The days that followed were harder than Eliza had ever imagined. The next morning, she woke to the harsh sound of a rooster crowing in the distance. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the heat already hung in the air, thick and heavy. She had barely slept, tossing and turning in the small, unfamiliar cabin. The bed was stiff, the sheets rough, and the only sounds that kept her company were the occasional creaks of the wooden beams overhead and the distant calls of animals outside. When she opened her eyes, the weight of the reality of her situation hit her like a cold gust of wind. She was a long way from home, far from everything that had ever been familiar to her. She had no friends, no family here, and no idea of what to expect from the man who was supposed to be her future. Eliza hesitated for a moment, staring at the ceiling. She had known that life in the West would be tough, but she hadn't expected it to feel so isolating. This was supposed to be her new beginning, but so far, it felt more like a punishment. Finally, she pushed herself out of bed, dressing in the simple clothes Daniel had suggested she wear. She had packed light for the journey, leaving behind most of her fancy dresses and delicate fabrics, knowing they would be of no use in this rough land. Her hands were shaking slightly as she tied her boots, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. When she stepped outside, the heat of the day was already pressing down, but she knew there was work to be done. As she made her way to the main house, she could see Daniel already working. He was bent over, fixing something on the wagon, his back turned toward her. He didn't notice her approach. Eliza stood for a moment, watching him. He looked different today, more tired somehow. His movements were quick and sure, but there was a weariness in the way he handled the tools. He wasn't the same man she had met the other day, the man who had been so cold, so distant. This man seemed like someone who had been worn down by the land, someone who had faced far too many struggles and disappointments. She cleared her throat, taking a few steps closer. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," she said softly. Daniel didn't turn to face her right away, but after a moment he gave a short nod. "Morning?" His voice was low, his tone still as hard and unwelcoming as it had been the day before. Eliza stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of what to say. She had hoped for a warmer greeting, maybe even a few words of kindness, but it seemed Daniel was still as closed off as ever. She had no idea what she was supposed to do next. The silence stretched between them like a wide, empty gap. "Well," Eliza started, trying to fill the uncomfortable pause. "What should I do today?" Daniel paused for a second, then nodded toward the barn. "There's always something to do around here. You can start by mucking out the stalls." Eliza blinked, surprised by the task. She hadn't expected this at all. Back home, her mother had taught her the ways of the kitchen and the garden, but never had she imagined having to clean out animal stalls. Still, she was here now and there was no turning back. "I see," Eliza said, trying to hide her unease. "I'll get started right away." Daniel gave a brief grunt, his attention already back on the wagon. Eliza wasn't sure if he had even heard her. With a sigh, she turned and walked toward the barn. The smell of hay and manure hit her as soon as she opened the door. The barn was larger than she had expected, filled with animals, horses, cows, and a few chickens. The sight of it was overwhelming, and for a moment Eliza just stood there taking it all in. She had never been around so many animals before. Her family had never kept livestock, and the closest she had come to farm work was when her father had let her help in the vegetable garden back home. This was something entirely different. Taking a deep breath, Eliza gathered her courage. She had no choice but to face this. She grabbed a shovel from the corner of the barn and began her work. It wasn't long before her arms began to ache and the heat made her sweat, but she pushed through it. She tried not to think about how out of place she felt, or how much she missed the comforts of home. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, shoveling out the dirty hay, making sure the animals were fed, and trying not to let the discomfort get to her. It wasn't easy, but she kept at it. Every now and then she'd glance up and see Daniel working in the distance, never offering a word of encouragement or even a glance in her direction. Eliza couldn't help but wonder why he was so distant, so cold toward her. Had he been like this all his life? Had the land and the hardships of the West hardened him this much? By midday, Eliza was exhausted. Her muscles were sore, her hands covered in dirt and blisters, and she was covered in sweat, but she was determined to finish the work. She wasn't going to back down now, not when she had come so far. She took a break for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow and leaning against the barn wall. As she rested, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. She looked up to see Daniel riding toward the barn on horseback. He didn't stop, but as he passed, he glanced at her. For the first time, there was something almost resembling an expression on his face, something between curiosity and acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make Eliza feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible to him after all. The rest of the afternoon passed in much the same way. Eliza worked hard and Daniel remained distant, only speaking to give her another task. The silence between them was uncomfortable, but Eliza learned to ignore it, focusing on the work. By the end of the day, her body ached in ways she had never imagined. She was covered in dust and sweat, her hands raw from the labor, but despite the physical exhaustion, there was a sense of accomplishment in her. She had done something. She had survived the day and she had made it through. As she walked back to the cabin that evening, she couldn't help but reflect on how different everything was from what she had imagined. This was no romantic adventure. There were no beautiful sunsets or charming moments of connection. There was only hard work, sweat, and the harsh reality of life on the ranch. But even as she thought about the difficulties, there was a part of her that was starting to feel proud of what she had done. She was surviving, and perhaps that was enough for now. As she reached the cabin, she saw Daniel standing in the doorway looking at her. His expression was as unreadable as always, but this time, there was a slight softness in his eyes. "You did good today," he said, his voice still rough but with an almost imperceptible note of approval. Eliza was taken aback. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small acknowledgement, a small step forward. She nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say in response. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, feeling a rush of warmth in her chest. Daniel didn't say anything more, just gave a brief nod before disappearing into the cabin. Eliza stood there for a moment, staring after him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Eliza's heart pounded as the train came to a slow stop in the small, dusty town. The once exciting adventure had started to feel far more real, and the reality of what she had just committed to began to settle in her chest like a weight. Stepping off the train, Eliza took in the scene around her. The town was smaller than she had imagined, the buildings simple and weathered by years of harsh winds and unforgiving sunlight. The air was dry and the scent of earth and animals hung thick in the air. A man, dressed in worn leather clothes with a wide-brimmed hat, was standing near the platform. He was the only person in sight, and Eliza figured he must be there to meet her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rough, stubbled face and eyes that looked like they had seen more than their fair share of trouble. His expression was serious, almost as if he was sizing her up, and Eliza felt a rush of nervousness flood her veins. This was Daniel Cross, the man she had come all the way to the west to meet. As Eliza walked toward him, the sun beat down on her skin, and she adjusted the heavy satchel she had been carrying for the long journey. Her dress, which had once seemed like a sensible choice for travel, was now far too warm for this dry heat, and she could feel the sweat starting to trickle down her neck. Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on her as she approached, his face unreadable. He didn't smile or offer a hand. He simply stood there, waiting for her to speak. Eliza forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. "Mr. Cross?" she asked, her voice sounding smaller than she meant it to. He nodded, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Eliza felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was real, she couldn't help but feel out of place. She had been prepared to meet a man who might be rough around the edges, but Daniel Cross's gaze was colder than she expected. "You're Eliza Mayfield?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. "Yes, that's me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I hope I'm not too much trouble." Daniel didn't answer her right away. He simply turned and started walking toward a wagon parked a few yards away. Eliza hesitated for a moment before following him. There was no warmth in his demeanor, no sign of the kindness she had hoped for, and the tension between them hung thick in the air. As they walked, Eliza tried to make small talk. "The train ride was long, but I managed. The scenery is very different from back home." Daniel didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed straight ahead. After a long moment, he muttered, "The West has a way of showing people things they didn't expect." Eliza frowned, unsure of what he meant. She didn't press him for more, though. She had been raised to never push too hard or too fast, to let things unfold at their own pace. Still, the silence between them was uncomfortable, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was how every day would feel out here. Was this what her future was going to be like? When they reached the wagon, Daniel motioned for her to climb in. Eliza hesitated for a moment, but then did as instructed. The ride to his ranch was long, and the heat was almost unbearable. The land seemed endless, with only a few scattered buildings and the occasional animal grazing in the fields. It was unlike anything Eliza had ever seen. There were no neat rows of houses or bustling streets, no comforting sounds of a town busy with life. It felt as if the land stretched on forever, empty and wild. As the wagon jolted over the rough dirt road, Eliza couldn't help but glance at Daniel. He sat at the front of the wagon, holding the reins with practiced ease. He didn't seem to mind the silence, but Eliza couldn't stand it. Her thoughts were racing, and the questions she had been trying to push aside came flooding back. Why had he been so distant when they first met? Was he disappointed in her already? Did he expect something different? "Mr. Cross," Eliza said, her voice tentative but filled with curiosity. I didn't expect the journey to be so different. I've only ever known life in the East. It's much more civilized, I suppose." Daniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Civilized," he repeated, as if testing the word. "This is as civilized as it gets out here, Miss Mayfield. There's no room for softness or pretense. If you can't handle the hard work, the dust, the long hours, then you're better off heading back." Eliza swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known it would be hard, but his words made her feel even more out of place. She wasn't sure she could handle it. Back home, her parents had always told her she was too smart for her own good, that no man would ever want a woman with ideas and ambition. But here, in the vast open wilderness, she felt even smaller and more insignificant than ever. Was this the man she had come to marry? The wagon continued its bumpy ride, and Eliza felt the weight of Daniel's words settle in her mind. She had left everything behind for a chance at something new, something better. But now, as the hours passed in silence, she wondered if this was just another mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at Daniel's ranch. It was a sprawling piece of land, with a few buildings that looked like they had been built with little more than rough-hewn wood and basic tools. There was a barn, a small cabin, and a couple of outbuildings that seemed to serve various purposes. It was all very basic, and the air smelled of livestock and sweat. Daniel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pointed to a small cabin near the barn. "That's where you'll stay for now. It's modest, but it'll do." Eliza stepped out of the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. The dust from the road clung to her shoes as she followed Daniel toward the cabin. She glanced around, taking in the surroundings. This was her new life. There would be no fancy furniture or servants to attend to her. There would be no cozy evenings by the fire, reading books or discussing ideas. This was the reality of the West, the harsh, unforgiving land where survival depended on hard work and tough decisions. When they reached the cabin, Daniel opened the door and motioned for Eliza to enter. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The room was small but clean, with simple furniture and a bed that looked like it would be just enough to sleep on after a long day's work. There was no decoration, no warmth, just the bare essentials. "I'll have breakfast ready for you at dawn," Daniel said, his voice still cold. "There's work to do. You can start tomorrow." Eliza nodded, but her heart sank. She had no idea what she had walked into, or if she was even capable of handling it. But as the door closed behind her, she realized there was no turning back. She was here, and she would have to find a way to make it work. The silence of the cabin was overwhelming as Eliza sat down on the bed, looking out the window at the wide, open land that stretched out before her. For the first time since leaving her hometown, she wasn't sure what her future held. Would Daniel ever warm to her? Would she ever find her place in this vast, lonely land? Or had she made a mistake coming here in the first place? As the night grew darker, Eliza felt a mix of fear and determination rise inside her. No matter what, she would survive. She had to. There was no turning back now. Eliza Mayfield stood at the window of her small, dimly lit room, staring out at the cobbled streets of her hometown. The wind had a chilly bite to it, and the smell of rain lingered in the air. She had always hated the cold weather, but it wasn't the weather that made her feel trapped. It was the life she lived, the life that seemed to close in on her with every passing day. The small town she had called home her entire life felt like a cage, and Eliza was the bird that yearned for freedom. As a young woman of 22, she had more education than most of the men in town. She could read, write, and even do basic arithmetic. But to the people around her, that wasn't something to be proud of. Her family, with their conservative values, didn't understand why she read books or why she wanted more than the life of a housewife. In their eyes, a woman's place was at home, caring for her husband and children, not in libraries, learning things that didn't have anything to do with running a household. Her father, a quiet man who rarely spoke but always had a sharp look in his eyes, would often sigh when he caught Eliza reading one of her books. "That's fine for a man, Eliza. he'd say, his voice low and serious. But you're a woman. No one wants to marry a woman who knows too much. You need to focus on finding a husband, not reading about things that won't help you in the kitchen or with the children. It wasn't that Eliza didn't want to marry. She did. But she wanted a partner. Not someone who would see her as a servant. Every time she tried to explain her thoughts to her father or anyone in town, they would frown at her, dismissing her ideas as foolish and impossible. It felt like everyone was telling her to be something she wasn't. Eliza's mother, a quiet woman who always did as she was told, kept out of these conversations. But Eliza knew her mother agreed with her father. She had been raised to think that a woman's worth was in her ability to keep a good home, raise children, and support her husband. That's the life her mother had led, and that's the life Eliza's family expected her to follow. As much as she tried to be the dutiful daughter, Eliza couldn't help but feel stifled by the expectations placed on her. There was a world beyond her small town, one filled with adventure, new ideas, and people who valued intelligence and progress. But how could she ever get there? How could she ever break free from the narrow path her family had laid out for her? One evening, as Eliza sat with her parents at the dinner table, the topic of marriage came up again. Her father cleared his throat and his sharp gaze landed on Eliza. "Eliza," he began, "we've been talking about your future. It's time for you to think about finding a good man. You're not getting any younger, and it's time for you to settle down." Eliza felt a rush of heat in her cheeks, but she stayed calm. "I don't want to settle down with just anyone, Father. I want someone who understands me, who shares my values." Her father's lips tightened into a thin line, and her mother quickly glanced away, as if she didn't want to be part of the conversation. "You need a man who can provide for you, Eliza. Your ideas are all well and good, but they won't help you when you're living in a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, trying to keep a fire going in the winter." That was it. That was the moment Eliza knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't live a life that was so predictable and suffocating. She didn't want to be confined to the role of a wife who stayed at home, waiting for a husband to tell her what to do. She needed more. The next day, Eliza's parents sat her down with a letter that had arrived in the mail. It was from a man in the West, someone who had been looking for a wife. He was a rancher in a small town far from where Eliza lived, and he had heard of her through a marriage agency that helped match people from different parts of the country. The man's name was Daniel Cross. As Eliza read the letter, she felt a mix of emotions. The man Daniel seemed kind enough. He had asked for a woman who was hardworking, caring, and able to manage a household. He didn't mention much about intelligence or education, but he promised a good life for a woman who could adapt to the rugged lifestyle of the West. It wasn't the life Eliza had imagined, but it was different. It was far from her family's home and the stifling expectations of her small town. Her parents were excited about the possibility of her leaving. They believed this was her chance to find a stable future, away from the distractions of learning and independence. "This is the opportunity you've been waiting for, Eliza," her father said, his voice filled with certainty. "You'll have a good life out there, and you'll be with a man who can give you everything you need." Eliza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had never imagined marrying a stranger, especially not one who expected a woman to be nothing more than a helper on a ranch. But she also knew that if she stayed, her life would never change. She would remain the too smart woman who would never find a man who could appreciate her. She had to leave. A few weeks later, Eliza stood at the train station, her suitcase in hand. Her parents had already said their goodbyes, but Eliza could see the relief in their eyes. They were glad to be rid of the burden of their unmarriageable daughter. As the train pulled away from the station, Eliza looked out the window, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She had no idea what the future held for her, but she was determined to find out. The journey to the West was long and uncomfortable, but Eliza couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement at the thought of starting over. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew she had to take the chance. The West was a land of opportunity, a place where people came to make their own futures. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the place where Eliza found herself. As the landscape changed from flat plains to rolling hills and mountains, Eliza thought about the man she was about to meet. Daniel Cross, would he be kind? Would he accept her as she was, or would he be like all the others, expecting her to play a role she wasn't sure she could fit into? The questions swirled in her mind, but Eliza held on to a single thought. She was free now. free to choose her path, even if she didn't know exactly where it would lead. The train clattered along the tracks, and Eliza looked out the window once again, the wide-open west stretching out before her.